There are many men in the Old Testament named Abinadab. I want to tell you about one of them. You probably don't know. He had at least 2 sons. You may recognize one of them. The first one's name is Ahio or Ahio, like Ohio with an A at the beginning. That's a son, crazy name, okay? The second son is named Uzzah, and they lived north of Jerusalem in the time of King David. And they had this incredible gift that we have to piece together in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And that is this, that as the kingship of Saul and David and all of these are beginning, they didn't know a lot of what to do with the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. They set that up in Shiloh, up in the north of Jerusalem, and they're going up there for feast days and all. But they often wanted to bring it into Jerusalem. They tried that, but Abinadab had a weird thing. They kept it at his house, this Abinadab. We don't know exactly how long, but can you imagine? It was like you have a guest over. Abinadab is like, yeah, welcome to our home. Thank you so much. They're like, can I use the restroom? Yes, it's the second door on the left, not the third door. Do not go through the third door because the Ark of the Covenant is there. And they're like, what? And they're like, yeah, I mean, we've kept it here for a while. We don't know really the story, but we know that when David wanted to bring it into Jerusalem, he goes to Abinadab and he's like, hey, can we bring it up? He's like, sure. Problem, his 2 sons, Ahio and Uzzah, they put it on an ox cart. And this is not how it was meant to be carried. So they put it on an ox cart, and David and a whole bunch of people are marching in front, and they're excited, except for the ox cart hits a little pothole. Ahio's in the front, and Uzzah happens to be on the side. He reaches out. You may remember this story in 2 Samuel 6. He reaches out to keep the ark from falling off the ox cart, which is what you would have done. It's just what I would have done. Only problem is you can't touch the Ark of the Covenant, right? And Uzzah dies right there for doing a great thing. And then David looks back and everybody starts screaming. And he goes, oh, we can't bring this into Jerusalem. This is too powerful. The presence of God is too powerful. So they take it and put it at a house nearby. This guy named Obed-Edom was just watching the parade, and it happened all in front of him. And then David looks at him, and he says, we're going to put it in your house. He's like, oh, okay. And so they put it in the house of Obed-Edom. And it's there for 3 months. And everything that Obed-Edom does is blessed. We don't know specifically, the text doesn't tell us what he means by blessed, but I imagine maybe he had more children. Maybe his crop came in like 60 times greater than it was. Maybe everything in it, maybe his wife's cooking was better. Maybe his cooking was better. I don't know how it all happened, but everything in his house was blessed, and it got back to David. He was like, we got to figure this out. So he goes back to Obed-Edom. And we aren't specified in the text, but they figured out they can't put it on a cart, and they have to carry it by poles, which is how God told Moses to do it in the book of Exodus. So they fashion new poles, or they find the poles, whatever. They slide it through the sides of the ark on the bottom, and at least 4 guys are carrying it into Jerusalem, and this is beautiful. David is so excited. He takes off his kingly garments, and it says that he's wearing a linen ephod, which is just like a linen undergarment. And I don't know how good of a dancer David was, but his wife doesn't think he's very good at all, okay? Michal is watching, maybe from the walls of Jerusalem or from his kingly palace, as David, is dancing in basically his linen undergarments before the Ark of the Covenant, as they finally, after hundreds of years, finally bring it into Jerusalem. And he's very excited. He offers all these sacrifices. He gets the priests in order. He's doing all this stuff, and it's cool. And then he goes home, and Michal is waiting at the door, tapping her foot. And David's like, what did I do? What did I do? And she's like, you embarrassed yourself in front of the whole city. That's what you did. He's like, what are you talking about? And she's like, your dance moves. I've been worrying about you for years. Been trying to tell you, like not very good. But that's not what she says. She's like, why did you take off your kingly garments? Why were you just wearing your linen ephod? How undistinguished that was. And David said, before the ark of the Lord. I danced with joy and with abandonment, and I will be even more undistinguished than this in his presence. I want to tell you a story in the New Testament of exactly the same thing. Someone who is so caught up in worship of the object of worship, that they do not care about the subject of worship, or the context of worship, or the cost of worship. They're so caught up with the object. That's what David was. He was caught up with the object, the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God. He's like, I don't care about me. I don't care what the reputation does. I don't care how much this costs me. I want to tell you a New Testament story that's exactly the same in the Gospel of John. So if you've got your Bibles, we'll be in John chapter 12. I encourage you to bring your Bibles. It's typically on the screen, but we'd love for you to bring your Bibles so you can underline, mark, circle things, write question marks in the margin, do whatever you need to do. But John chapter 12 tells us a story that reminded me and should remind you of that story of David in 2 Samuel. John chapter 12, this is the way numbers work, comes after 11, which comes after 10. All very important. Because John chapter 10 involves the last feast of that series, and it's the Feast of Dedication, what we would call Hanukkah these days. And Jesus does all of this. Many believe in him. Then he retreats away. He goes down into the east, across the Jordan, and he doesn't come back for a while until Lazarus, this is chapter 11, until Lazarus has died. He comes back to Bethany. We saw this last couple of weeks. He raised Lazarus from the dead, the greatest so far of the signs in the book of signs. And then he retreats again away. And now we're leading up into Passover. No one knows this because they're a little bit hard-headed. No one knows this except Jesus. It seems in the text, including the people in this story. No one knows this, but this is the last Passover for Jesus. He is days away from his execution. And only he knows that it's coming. He's tried to warn his disciples. They do not understand. Even at the Last Supper, which is a Passover meal in the Garden of Gethsemane, they do not understand that it is imminent, like it's happening right now, minutes away, not days or years. They don't understand. That's the context, the theological and time context of this. The relational context of the story is Lazarus. And so I'm going to read it. It's very short. We're just 11 verses today. It's a story, and I want you, I want to not test you. I want to encourage some hermeneutical skills, okay? I'm going to read it. You can follow along. You can just listen to it. I'll actually read it twice. And I want you to see what's repeated. I want you to notice what's repeated, including names and things like that. What's repeated is often really, really important. And these 11 verses, there's something right in the middle of these 11 verses that is typically in a unit story like this, often very important, okay? So John chapter 12, I'll read 11 verses, I'll read it twice, okay? John chapter 12, verse 1, Jesus, therefore 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." The large crowd of the Jews then learned that Jesus was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. The chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. A second time, Not to condescend or patronize, but a second time to see if you see what is repeated. It's really important, okay? Indulge. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, you do not always have me." The large crowd of the Jews then learned that Jesus was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Anything that was repeated? Did you notice that the name of Lazarus is said twice at the top and twice at the end? And it's always said Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead, at the beginning and at the end. Jesus' name is mentioned like 6 or 7 times. We have Mary, we have Martha. What's right in the center of the story, not so much the little add-on couple of verses at the end, but right in the center of the story is this statement, "And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume." Right in the center. All of these can be very, very important as we look into a text like this, okay? Now, again, the theological and time context is Passover. The relational and spiritual context of the story is the raising of Lazarus. It says it at the beginning, and it says it at the end. Jesus came back to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom he'd raised from the dead. And at the end, the chief priests were coming, and the people were coming to see Lazarus, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And they wanted to put Lazarus to death because many were believing in Jesus. Now, let's look at these things. This is really, really important. I want to teach you a couple of things about this. And we're going to look at the personages here, okay? Talk to me. What is Martha doing? Well, Martha's doing what Martha does, right? Martha's serving. So he comes to Bethany, and Martha's serving. What is Lazarus doing? Well, Lazarus is reclining at the table. And what is Mary doing? Well, Mary's the focus of the story, and she's adoring Jesus in this extravagant act of anointing him with this perfume. Just for a second, I forgot to place the days. This is really important. I'll put a calendar up on the screen. When I was an adjunct professor, the last week of Jesus' life was always on my Gospels final exam because it's important to know kind of what's happening on these days, right? What day is this that we're talking about now? Almost assuredly, it's either late Friday night after the first 3 stars appear in the sky, which means that it's Saturday for Jews, the Sabbath, or it's Saturday night. This is very likely a Sabbath dinner that they have prepared for Jesus. And so he's traveling back to Judea. We don't exactly know when, but Jews weren't supposed to travel very far on the Sabbath, so he's got to get to Bethany by the Sabbath, which is Saturday. The next day, Sunday, the next verse 12 says the next day, Jesus goes down into Jerusalem as his official representation and arrival as the king of the Jews. This is what we call the triumphal entry. He turns over the tables, has his temple tantrum is what I call it, and does all the things. Curses a fig tree on Monday. Teaches, Tuesdays teaches, Wednesday the plot thickens. He has the Olivet Discourse on the Mount of Olives. This is Matthew 23, 24, 25. And then Thursday, of course, is the Passover meal, including not only the meal itself, but the upper room discourse to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. He is betrayed, arrested, and the trials begins. Friday, the trials continue, and then he is sentenced, scourged, crucified, died, buried. Saturday is the silent Saturday of Sabbath. And then Sunday, of course, the Feast of First Fruits is when Jesus is risen from the... This is how close we are. So the story of the supper that we just talked about is up at the top, that first Sabbath Saturday. Now, back to the personages. Martha is serving, Lazarus is reclining, and Mary is adoring. Question, which one of them is worshiping? All of them. All of them are worshiping. Here's the first thing I need you to see. We may be tempted to focus on Mary only in the story because the story does focus on her extravagant act of love, very costly. But just because Lazarus is reclining and Martha is serving the meal, doesn't mean that there's necessarily a difference between their engagement with and for Jesus and Mary's. The story is about Mary. Now, you may read in your Gospels, you can go later on today or tomorrow and go to Matthew 26 and go to Mark 14. You'll see the same story with a different focus. They don't include Mary's name, and they put it at a house in Bethany of a man named Simon, who either was or used to be a leper, the house of Simon the leper. And so we would assume that this story is at Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house, but it's not. It's in Bethany, and this is a big sort of village dinner. Jesus is coming back. By this point in his career, he's very popular, and he's come back to Bethany. They know it, and so the village throws a party, a Sabbath meal for Jesus, probably at the house of Simon the leper, or at least the house that used to belong to Simon the leper and was known as such. And so they are there. Martha is in the kitchen serving. Lazarus is reclining. This is setting us up for an understanding of the Passover meal with the disciples, where Jews reclined at a meal. They don't sit at a table. So I know Passion of Jesus, Mel Gibson has Jesus the carpenter, building a big table. And he says, well, what is his mother? This is a table for kings. So how are they going to sit like this? And then she's like, oh, this is nice. Well, that's not how they did it in the Jewish time. At certain meals, they reclined mostly on their left side on large cushions. So their feet were away from the table and their shoulders were near the table, and they ate and drank with their right hand. This is true at the Passover dinner, and we know where people are seated. Judas at the Passover dinner is on the backside of Jesus to his left, which is the seat of honor at the Passover meal. Judas. John is to his right, and Peter's on the other side of the table, because Peter motions to John one time and says, John asked Jesus a question, and it says that John leant back on the chest of Jesus to ask him a question. So they're all reclining. This is the way I need you to see the story here. To help, I'll give you an image. I love art. This is an art by James Tissot, one of my favorite. It's hard to see, but you see them reclining on cushions. You see Mary in the bottom, hair on the feet of Jesus. People are looking. Jesus is motioning to her. This is quite a shocking moment. Before we get to the shock and the extravagance of it, I need you to see Martha is serving. Lazarus is reclining by Jesus. This may be the guy in the blue here with the short, curly, dark hair. Mary is adoring Jesus, but all three of them are worshiping, or could be worshiping him. We tend to think service. Let's talk about Martha for a second. We just get a line. Martha was serving. And when we read Luke 10, which my friend Tyler taught here a couple months ago, we're like, that's very Martha of you, Martha. Very good, What is Mary doing? Well, Mary's at the feet of Jesus. Did you know this about Mary? Every time she appears in the Gospels, she's at the feet of Jesus. Every time. In Luke 10, when Martha's serving, and she's upset at her sister. Where is her sister? Her sister is sitting at the feet of Jesus. It's the first time we see her. The second time we see her is in the last chapter when Jesus shows up at Lazarus' funeral, and she comes running out after Martha has the encounter with her. And what does she do? She falls at the feet of Jesus. This is the third and last time we see Mary. And where is she? At the feet of Jesus. There's something that breaks in my spirit when I hear that. Every time we see Mary, she's at the feet of Jesus. And here she is anointing. We're going to talk about that wiping with her hair, how extravagant and sort of shocking that was. If Martha could be worshiping, because the word for service, we get a word for that we often use in church. That word is called liturgy. The liturgy of a worship service in the church means service. So service is very, very connected to the idea of worship, both in Old and New Testament, in the Hebrew and in the Greek. So it could say that Martha, in the kitchen, wherever she was doing, the house of Simon the leper, was worshiping. Now here's the heart, that's easy for us. We're like, yeah, I get it. Worshiping and serving the Lord, we get to come here and we do this and we set up tables if you're on our team, or we get to serve the Lord's Supper and we do this and we do that. And it is an act of worship and it's right. How do you relate to the reclining Lazarus being a worshiper? That's sometimes a little harder. I feel guilty sometimes when I rest. Sometimes when I cease doing and all I am is really being, I don't feel worthy. I don't feel like I'm doing enough. I don't feel like I'm pleasing God. Can anybody relate here? I think that's a common human experience. Lazarus reclining with Jesus is a way that you and I can worship. When we let down our tools, when we set down all of our work, push the chair back from the desk, and we say, I've got nothing to offer, nothing to say, nothing to do, nothing to serve, I'm just going to be. Does God love me when I'm just being, when I'm not doing something like Martha, when I'm not adoring like Mary? Can I be a Lazarus reclining next to Jesus in this story and be a worshiper? The answer is yes. In fact, it's built into the code of the Old and New Testament. Did you ever think about how when God creates the days in Genesis, how he calls them the day? He says there was evening and then there was morning the first day. I always thought that was weird. Have you thought that was weird? You ever noticed that? That's not how we count days. Our day starts when we get up. We get up with the sunrise, so the day starts at the sunrise. We would say there was morning and then there was evening the first day. That's not how God says it. He says there was evening, then there was morning the first day. Why does he say that? It's very important. This is baked into the Sabbath, which comes later. This is baked into God's love for us. In an agrarian society where there's no light bulbs or headlights, what can you do at night? Well, you can't work. You can't produce. God is saying, I start my day, which is why the Jews count the day when the first 3 stars appear in the sky. When the first 3 stars appear in the sky today, for Jews all around the world, especially in Israel, today, first 3 stars, it will be Monday for them. Their day starts at night when they don't work. They just have to be. They just have to rest. God is saying, subtly at first, and then continually through, I do not love you for what you give me, as if I was incomplete in myself and needed what you gave me. God does not need something that we offer. I start my day counting when you finish work, not when you start it. So is it possible for you to engage a Lazarus reclining as a way of worshiping God? Yes. But let's talk about Mary, because that's where the story obviously focuses. Notice the context. Mary comes adoring Jesus with this fragrant and expensive perfume. We'll talk about that in a second. Why do you think she's doing this? Well, the story tells us. The story tells us at the beginning, Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead, and at the end, Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. Mary is the sister of Lazarus. In the last chapter, she was begging him to do all that he could, and he did, and now it's only proper that she comes as a response, right? It's connected. And so she comes with gratitude. That's the first piece of context we get. She clearly comes with gratitude. Jesus, you brought my brother back from the dead. Who has ever done that before? I am so unworthy, so grateful. I'm going to spend extravagant adoration and worship of you. But what does Jesus connect it to? This is highly instructive. In a simple passage of 11 verses, really just 9 or 8, and then 3 at the end, what is Jesus connected to? He connects it to his death. He says, she has kept this, let her alone. She's kept it for the day of my burial. Do you see that? I'm convinced that Mary came out of gratitude. Jesus connects it with grief that's coming. Mary says, you have risen my brother from the dead. Jesus says, I'm about to die. And here is the beautiful spectrum of the context of worship. All the way from gratitude, the things that we know and things that God has done, all the way over here to grief, the things we don't know, the things that God hasn't done yet. Here's the spectrum of worship. I love the fact that Jesus connected this to his death. Otherwise, I would be tempted to think that worship, adoration, happens only over here when God has already done something, when God has answered my prayer and I have something to be grateful for. But here in the text, he says, no, you can actually worship from a place of grief, from a place of a prayer that's not answered yet, from something that you don't know what's going on. This side, gratitude, says, thank you for what you've done. You are amazing. You are and have been amazing, been so good, so gracious. Over here, this worship says, I don't know what's going on. I'm in pain and I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to grab hold of you who knows all things, who has the power to redeem and restore all things. So if this is the spectrum of worship, if Martha and Lazarus and Mary are all potentially worshiping, not just Mary, what is worship? I tell you, I'm very convicted by this because as a pastor, I continually use words in a way that's not helpful. I'll give you an example. I did it just a few minutes ago. Hey, for the first half an hour, we're going to worship. The assumption is after that, we're not. Or it's just a little 30-minute thing, right? That connects worship almost entirely to music, right? I use those words poorly because worship actually has zero to do with music. Music is a method and a mechanism that can allow us to worship, but worship is not synonymous with music. Worship is also prayer. Worship is also silence. As we said, worship is also work and service. Worship is also just being, just sitting, just reclining with Jesus. Worship can also be study. Worship can also be your work at the oil and gas office, in the conference room. Your work as a ballet school teacher, your work as a mom who stays home while your husband is out and raises the family, your work as a husband who is on a plane more than you're in a car, that can be worship too. So what is it? Harold Best, incredible book called Unceasing Worship, just defines worship as a continuous outpouring. And I love that. A continuous outpouring of who I am, all that I ever will be to God. A continuous outpouring. And I like that because I see Mary in it, don't you? But not just Mary. Let's talk just for a second. We're going to finish our story, and then we're going to bring the band back up and worship with music, okay? I get it. We're going to worship in some other ways too. But think about in the very beginning. Do you see God in the act of creation, especially when Adam and Eve are in the garden before chapter 3? Do you see God pouring himself out? I do. Especially in what we call the image of God. He pours himself out into Adam and Eve, before she even has a name, into the man and to the woman, pours himself out in his image so that they were created in his image. We are created in his image. This idea of pouring, I see in the sacrificial system of the tabernacle and then the temple. When we would come and bring offerings, if it was even sometimes flour mixed with oil. We would pour it out on the altar. Sometimes it was just oil or wine, pour it out on the altar. Sometimes if it was an animal sacrifice, we'd collect the blood and then pour it out on the altar. This is worship, sacrifice, redemption, atonement, but there's a pouring out. We also see a pouring out on top of priests of anointing and on top of kings. Pour oil out on their head. The story of Mary isn't the only one. Jesus, in just a few short days, as we saw, is going to pour his blood out. We celebrate that in the Lord's Supper in just a little bit. Pour out his life for you. Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 6, probably the last thing that he wrote that we have still, is writing to Timothy, and he says, I already am being poured out like a drink offering. I know that the end of my life is near. That means that our life, entire, continuous outpouring is possible for worship. So here's the big idea we see in Mary, and we're going to go back to it. You were not born to worship. Have you heard that before? You were born to worship. You were made to worship. You were not born to worship. I disagree. The better statement is you were born worshiping. You are a worshiper. In fact, I don't believe you can stop doing it. You're constantly worshiping. The big question is, what and who are you worshiping and how? Because this is the image of God in us. How can we run from the image of God? We can't. We can suppress it. We can cover it over with sin and disobedience. We can't tear that part away from us. And if the image of God in us is this worship role, that means that it is who we are. You were not born to worship. You are a worshiper. You were born worshiping. I think every day, all day, we worship. Just depends on what. I'll give you a really good short list of my favorite things to worship. Number one, Scot Pollok. Me. My comfort, my way of things, whatever. It's a constant idol that I go to. When I'm not focusing my attention and affection on Jesus, I will slip into this flesh over here, and the person sitting on the throne is not Jesus, it's me. There's lots of other things. I am constantly worshiping. So are you. I don't think we can avoid it. Everywhere we go in the scriptures, I see that truth. Does it spike every now and then? Of course. There are time and space elements of worship. There are time and space elements of worship like this, like a Sunday, or a worship concert that you go to. But that's not the only time that you worship. That would be like this, going through an endless buffet of beautiful delights that which you can constantly eat from, and then coming to a dish that reminds you of home. When you come to a dish that reminds you of home, you're like, oh, wait, this is special. This is different than all the infinite table of delights. That's what time and space worship does. We're constantly worshiping. Then we come to a time and space like this, and we get momentum and energy together as the church, and incredible people lead us, and we have an expectation and an energy, and the Spirit is moving. Well, woo, this reminds me of home. But I can eat all day, every day, because I'm a worshiper all day, every day. A continuous outpouring. Now, Mary, I want you to think about this story not as a Westerner, especially not as a woman in the room who may have your hair down because it's completely acceptable for you to do. Not in the time of Jesus. A woman in the time of Jesus only let her hair down in the presence of her husband. We don't know if Mary is married, but she lets her hair down here. This is a bit like David taking off his kingly garments, being very undistinguished, no? More often, we focus on the cost of the perfume. I did a quick Google search. Average income of a U.S. citizen, $75,000 a year. Wild. If you take off the top 10 people, which is like Musk and those guys, right? It drops down to 65. We'll just go with 60. $60,000 a year. Can you imagine having a vial of perfume that costs $60,000? You are starting to understand why Judas spoke up, aren't you? I am. Like, hey, can we talk about this? What's going on here? But here is Mary breaking the vial. It says in Matthew 26 and Mark 14. That doesn't mean she smashed the alabaster jar. It means she broke the stopper at the top and poured it all out. Pliny the Younger, in his natural history, I think there's Pliny the Elder, one of the Plinies, in his natural history, talks about this specific perfume and says it was from India. It smelled like gladiolas, and it was red in color. I like the red in color thing. Let's think about that. Pouring it, Matthew and Mark say on his head also, but also his feet. John focuses on the feet in particular because that's where Mary is. Pours it on his head. Do you think it got on his garments? Yeah, I think so. It was red. Do you see the picture in your mind? If it was red, dripping off of his hair onto his very light-colored, statistically speaking, very common Jewish color, this light cream linen, red dripping onto that, and then pouring it down on his feet, getting on his feet, this would have looked a lot like blood, perhaps. And then the fragrance of that filling the room, her wiping his feet with her hair. Again, shocking, inappropriate, undistinguished, extravagant, all of those things. Now, why? Well, because like David bringing the ark in 2 Samuel 6, he says, I am so abandoned and consumed by the object of my worship that I do not have any thought for the subject, me, the context, or the cost. This is Mary. I am so consumed with love and gratitude for the object of my worship, Jesus. I don't care what people say about me. I don't care about the cost. I don't care what it looks like. This is what I have to do. This is what I have to do. This story is fascinating to me in so many different ways. And it encourages me. I want to bring the band back up again, not because worship has anything to do with music, but because I want to practice this, not just talk about it, okay? The last thing I want to say, if we can put this back up on the screen, is what Jesus said in verse 7 and 8. Look at what Jesus said in verse 7 and 8. Therefore Jesus said, let her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. I have a problem with this, and so does almost every scholar that I've read this week in study. Every commentary points this out. Every single one. I don't know if you saw it, but in Jesus' words, there's a little bit of a question. Let her alone, that's not the problem. The second phrase, the purpose phrase, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. Question, what is she keeping? What is the it? Because the context tells us that she poured all of it out. Otherwise, Judas wouldn't have been upset that it was all wasted, right? She poured all of it out. She did not ration it. She did not tithe it. She poured it all out. So what is she keeping? I've labored over this. I've thought about it. I've tried to find the smartest men and women who write about this, and I've read what they wrote. None of them have really good answers. And then I think the Lord said to me, Scott, this is not a theological problem. There's something beautiful in this about relationship and worship. There's something beautiful in this about spiritual. It's not syntactical. It's not what the it is, although it is. But it's what she did. Here's what I think is happening. This is helpful for us. When we pour everything out to God in worship, he says there's something in that you get to keep. She wasted it all. We even sang that in the song. I waste my hours and my days in the house of the Lord in his presence. When she wasted it, there is something that she gets to keep in the waste, in the worldly vision of waste. Jesus says, we and she will be talking about this forever. In Matthew and Mark, he says, this story of this woman will be told forever because of what she done. She poured it all out. She not only risked in the way that she did it, she poured it all out and she got to keep it. I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by it. So I think there's an invitation in that for us. Not only an invitation for extravagant generosity, faith, and trusting God, but to say that if there's an emotion that I have to lay out and pour out, I can risk that. I can pour it out and still keep a beautiful worship. It's almost as if God is saying, you can't go too far when you worship me. There's not too much you can give. There's not too much undistinguished honor in the way that you worship me. I love this phrase. It's so problematic, but because it's not theological, it's not exegetical, it's not syntactical. It's a spiritual truth. It's a relational truth. It's a worship truth. That when we spend it all, Jesus says we can keep it. I think he said it in other ways in the Gospels. When you lose your life, you will find it. But when you try to save your life, you lose it. This is the principle lived out in Mary. I'm going to spend $60,000 on a moment. Everybody else thinks it's a waste except Jesus. Jesus says, no, this is proper. It's not a waste. And there's something beautiful in this that she will get to keep and that my church will be talking about until I return. And here we are today, talking about her story and what she did. I don't believe you were made to worship. Of course that's true. But being very specific, I think you were made worshiping. You are a worshiper. You can do it like Martha, and many of us can. You can do it like Mary and adore extravagantly. You can also do it like Lazarus, reclining. A continuous outpouring. I'll tell you that when I was in college and I got saved as a freshman at A&M, I started to enter into these groups and experiences and churches, and I'd never experienced musical worship like that before. It was all brand new to me. The breakaway ministries, I went and I was like, I didn't know people did this. I just never had an experience like that before. I was nearly 19 years old. I had never had a corporate worship experience like that. Grew up in the Catholic Church, which I'm very grateful for, but our worship experience was very, very different, right? At least in my hometown. And so I was like, this is brand new. Well, I was a sort of musical. I can't do anything that these people do up here, okay? But I was sort of musical because I was in the band, different things in high school, and I was a percussion player and a drummer. And so I started running in these circles at A&M about a year into my walk with Jesus. And somebody's like, hey, can you help us on the praise team, on the worship team? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, first. And second, I can't read music. And they're like, aren't you a drummer? I kid you not, I'm not making this up. I was like, yeah. They're like, come and play with us. I'm like, you don't even have any drums. I'm not making this up. They said, we have an empty Ozarka water bottle from the office. And I was like, those big blue ones that you turn upside down? They're like, yeah, it's empty. Could you play that? And I was like, are you serious? Is this a joke? They're like, no. And I played an Ozarka water bottle for months. Everybody loved it, apparently. Saved up enough money to buy something that was actually called a drum that nobody had ever drank from, okay? And then I played that. And then I started to figure out, after years, how, and these guys do it so beautifully, how I can connect with God while I'm playing an instrument. It took me a long time to do that. And then I got to a place where it was difficult for me to connect to the presence of God in worship if I wasn't playing an instrument, so I continued to play that for years and years. Almost every Sunday I was playing with bands, and then I would get up and preach and teach, and as a student pastor, it was amazing. Then when I stopped doing that, it took me years to sit and not just watch the drummer and watch the music people. It took me years to come back to a sense of engaging the presence of God while not playing an instrument. But again, it has nothing to do with music. Worship does. It's just a method. It's just a mechanism for us. It took me a couple of years before COVID and then COVID to experience how I can worship God in desperate prayer. That's what COVID did for me, among many other things. COVID taught me during that really difficult time, confusing time, especially as a pastor, it taught me to hit my knees in a new place, in a new way. And it taught me to engage the presence of God. And I found myself worshiping while I was desperately praying that God would make a way. It took the last couple of years of a sort of a desert wilderness experience for me, never feeling like I was separate from God, never feeling like God was distant from me by God's grace, but feeling like I didn't know what His calling was for my life. It took several years of that to experience how I could just sit, almost like a Lazarus, sit with God, not doing anything, not feeling like I had any momentum in a specific direction. And God teaching me, this can be worship too, Scott. It took a long time for me to accept that and to begin to take my first baby steps into experiencing that. Silence, solitude. Scripture study's easy for me. It's probably my second favorite. I love musical worship. Second favorite is just surrounding myself with books and digging into Greek and Hebrew and the scriptures. I hear the voice of God. It's a worship for me. That's why I love preaching so much, because I get to worship while I do it. Serving people, plowing a field, or planting a garden, or cooking a meal. I'm telling you, continuous outpouring. It's not just about music and prayer. It's all of those things and more. It's in your office. It's in your car ride home. It's when you're up in the middle of the night with a sick child. It's when you're mourning the loss of someone. It's when you're mourning the past and the life that you thought you would have. All of those are a context for a continuous outpouring of all that you are to all that God is. Worship. Mary teaches us that. Martha teaches us that. Jesus does. Let me pray for you, and then we're going to practice some of these things in our time remaining. Father, we bless you.